In 1992, one of the most successful musicians on the planet ended his marriage with a fax that took less than a minute to send. That man was Phil Collins. Just 7 years earlier, he had performed at Live Aid 1985 in front of over 160,000 people across 2 continents in a single day, flying by Concorde from London to Philadelphia. With 7 #1 hits in the U.S. and more than 100 million records sold, he had total control over his career. But within a few years, the public turned against him, and the man who dominated the 80s began to collapse in silence. At his peak, Phil Collins wasn't just successful, he was dominating every layer of the music industry at once. Between 1984 and 1989, he placed 13 songs in the U.S. top 10, including 7 #1 hits. His 1985 album, No Jacket, sold over 25 million copies worldwide and earned 3 Grammy Awards, turning him into one of the most commercially powerful artists of the decade. For a period of time, it felt almost impossible to avoid him. His voice was on the radio every hour. His videos were on MTV every day. His songs were everywhere. But what made Collins different was not just the numbers. It was how many roles he controlled at the same time. He was still the lead singer of Genesis, one of the biggest bands of the era, while also running a massive solo career. At the same time, he was writing, producing, and performing for other major artists. Few musicians in history have operated at that level across so many fronts simultaneously. Then came July 13, 1985, Live Aid. In less than 24 hours, Phil Collins did something no other artist had ever done. He performed at Wembley Stadium in London in front of 72,000 people. Within hours, he boarded the Concorde, flew across the Atlantic, and appeared again on stage in Philadelphia, performing in front of nearly 90,000 more. The entire world watched it live. It wasn't just a performance. It was a display of total control over time, distance, and audience. At that moment, Collins wasn't just part of the music industry. He was defining it. A drummer who became a global frontman. A songwriter who turned personal pain into universal hits. A man who seemed calm, precise, and completely in control of everything around him. But that level of visibility came with a cost. When you are everywhere, people don't just notice you. They begin to question you. And when that shift happens, it doesn't take long for admiration to turn into resistance. The higher he climbed, the more fragile everything became. Phil Collins was born on January 30th, 1951, in Chiswick, West London, into a household that looked stable on the surface but quietly shaped his obsession with control. His father worked in insurance, a job built on structure and predictability. His mother was a theatrical agent connected to the West End stage, constantly surrounded by actors, auditions, and the idea that performance was something you had to earn. There was no chaos in the house, but there was expectation. Not spoken directly, but always present. At the age of 5, Collins received a toy drum kit. What started as a simple gift quickly turned into a fixation. He would sit for hours, listening to records and trying to replicate every rhythm he heard. There was no formal training at first, no teacher correcting him, just repetition and an unusual level of patience for a child. He wasn't loud. He wasn't rebellious. He was precise, almost a fault. His mother's connections led him into acting at a young age. He appeared in stage productions, including Oliver, in the West End, and even had a brief, nearly invisible appearance in the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night. On paper, it looked like a promising start. He was in the right rooms, around the right people, at the right time. But as he grew older, something became clear. He wasn't standing out. Audition after audition ended the same way. Not selected. Not distinctive enough. Not the face they were looking for. These rejections didn't explode into visible frustration. They settled quietly, each one pushing him further towards something he could control completely. That became music. By his early teens, Collins was already playing in local bands around London. Small venues, inconsistent gigs, often little to no money. But this environment gave him something far more important than recognition. It gave him repetition under pressure. He learned how to stay locked into rhythm, no matter what the room felt like. He learned how to support other musicians without needing attention. What set him apart was not style, but reliability. Other players could be more expressive, more aggressive, more visually striking. Collins was something else. He was consistent. He didn't miss. And in music, especially in a band setting, that mattered more than personality. At 16, he attended the Barbara Speake Stage School, continuing to study both acting and music. But the pattern didn't change. Acting roles remained small, temporary, and ultimately insignificant. Music kept growing. He joined several groups, including Flaming Youth, which gave him his first real experience recording in a studio. The band didn't succeed commercially. It faded quickly, like many others at the time. But for Collins, it confirmed a direction. He didn't need to be the center to be valuable. He could build everything from behind. Unlike many musicians of his generation, Collins wasn't driven by rebellion or excess. He wasn't chasing chaos. He was chasing accuracy. He would play the same part over and over until it felt exact. That mindset separated him from others, but it also created a kind of internal pressure. Mistakes weren't acceptable. Being average wasn't acceptable. Everything had to be right. By the end of the 1960s, he wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy, but he had built something far more durable than early success. He had discipline. He had control. And he had learned how to work without recognition. That foundation would become critical because the opportunity that was about to arrive wouldn't reward ego. It would reward patience, awareness, and the ability to step forward at exactly the right moment. In 1970, that moment finally appeared. In 1970, Phil Collins saw a small advertisement in Melody Maker. Genesis was looking for a new drummer. At the time, they were not a global phenomenon, but they had a reputation for complex, ambitious music. Collins went to the audition with no expectation of becoming anything more than a session player. What separated him from the others wasn't volume or flair. It was restraint. He listened carefully, studied the structure, and then played with exact control. The band noticed immediately. He got the job. From the beginning, Collins was positioned behind the spotlight. Genesis revolved around Peter Gabriel, a frontman known for theatrical costumes and surreal storytelling. Gabriel was the face, the narrative, the energy. Collins remained in the background, sitting behind the drum kit, invisible to most of the audience. But from that position, he was learning something deeper than performance. He was observing how a frontman shaped emotion, how pacing controlled attention, and how a crowd could be guided without force. Genesis music in the early 1970s was demanding. Long compositions, shifting time signatures, and intricate arrangements that required total precision. Collins became the anchor. When the structure became unpredictable, he was the one holding everything together. He wasn't the star, but he was essential. That role fit him perfectly. No need for attention, only for accuracy. Then in 1975, the structure collapsed. Peter Gabriel left the band. For Genesis, this was a crisis. Gabriel had to find their identity. Without him, they risked losing everything. The band launched an extensive search for a new singer, auditioning hundreds of candidates. None of them fit. Collins remained in the room through the entire process, helping guide the auditions, teaching vocalists how to approach the songs, how to match the band's tone. Ironically, he understood the role better than anyone. Eventually, the band stopped looking outside. They turned to him. Collins hesitated. He had never seen himself as a frontman. He didn't have the dramatic presence or the visual identity that Gabriel brought. But when he began to sing during rehearsals, something shifted. His voice wasn't theatrical. It was direct, restrained, and human. It didn't overwhelm the music. It connected with it. In 1976, Genesis released A Trick of the Tail with Collins as lead vocalist. The result surprised everyone. The band didn't collapse, they evolved. The music became more accessible, more emotionally grounded, less abstract. Collins had moved from the background into the center, not by force, but by necessity. At the same time, something else was changing outside the band. Collins' personal life was beginning to fracture. The pressure of constant touring, distance, and emotional disconnect began to damage his first marriage. By the end of the 1970s, the relationship broke down completely. He didn't react publicly. There were no dramatic statements, no interviews. Instead, he retreated inward. He returned home, and began recording alone. No large studio, no band structure, no expectations. Just a drum machine, a keyboard, and space to process what he was feeling. The music that came out of that period was different. It wasn't structured for a band. It wasn't designed to fit into Genesis. It was minimal, direct, and emotionally exposed. This wasn't about complexity anymore. It was about release. Out of that isolation came In the Air Tonight. The song built slowly, almost empty at first, holding tension without resolution. Then it broke open with a drum fill that would become one of the most recognizable moments in music history. It didn't sound like anything else at the time. It felt controlled, but underneath that control was something unresolved. When it was released in 1981 as part of his solo debut Face Value, it marked a turning point. The album became a massive success, selling millions of copies and establishing Collins as a solo artist separate from Genesis. For the first time, he wasn't just supporting a structure. He was creating his own. The drummer who had built his identity in the background had stepped fully into the center. And this time, there was no one else to absorb the pressure. By the early 1980s, Phil Collins had moved from a respected musician to a figure who controlled almost every layer of the music industry. What made this period different wasn't just success. It was saturation. He wasn't operating in one lane. He was everywhere at once. As a solo artist, he was dominating charts. As the frontman of Genesis, he was leading one of the most successful bands of the era. At the same time, he was producing and collaborating with other major artists, shaping the sound of the decade from multiple directions. Few musicians in history have sustained that level of presence without something breaking underneath. Between 1984 and 1989, the numbers became almost overwhelming. Collins placed 13 songs in the U.S. Top 10, including 7 that reached number 1. His 1985 album, No Jacket, sold over 25 million copies worldwide and earned 3 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. Tracks like Susudio and One More Night didn't just perform well. They dominated radio rotation and MTV at a level that made his voice almost impossible to avoid. For a period of time, turning on the radio meant hearing Phil Collins within minutes. But what made Collins unique was not just the success of his solo career. Genesis was also reaching its commercial peak at the exact same time. The band's 1986 album Invisible Touch produced 5 U.S. top 5 singles, including a number 1 hit. This was a level of mainstream success that Genesis had never reached before. Collins was effectively leading 2 massive careers at once, one as a solo artist, one as the voice of a global band, each feeding into the other, each expanding his reach further. Then came July 13, 1985, Live Aid. In less than 24 hours, Collins created one of the most iconic moments in music history. He performed at Wembley Stadium in London in front of 72,000 people. Immediately after, he left the stage, traveled to Heathrow, boarded the Concorde, and flew across the Atlantic in just a few hours. By the same day, he was standing on stage again in Philadelphia, performing in front of nearly 90,000 more people. The entire world watched it live. No other artist attempted it. No other artist could. That moment wasn't just impressive. It was symbolic. It represented complete control over time, distance, and performance. Collins wasn't just part of the event. He became one of its defining images. A drummer who had started in the background was now operating at the center of global attention, moving between continents as if there were no limits. At that point, his image was clear and consistent. He wasn't a chaotic rock star. He wasn't unpredictable. He represented something different: precision, reliability, and emotional accessibility. His songs were built on personal themes, but delivered in a way that felt safe for a mass audience. He became the face of a certain kind of success, controlled, stable, and widely accepted. But that same image began to create pressure. The more visible Collins became, the more familiar he felt. And familiarity, when it reaches a certain level, begins to shift. What once felt impressive starts to feel repetitive. What once felt dominant starts to feel excessive. By the late 1980s, his presence was constant. Radio, television, charts, collaborations, live performances. There was no space where he wasn't present. At the same time, the music landscape was beginning to change. A new wave of artists was emerging, bringing a different kind of energy, less polished, less controlled, more raw, more confrontational. Compared to that shift, Collins' music began to feel too clean, too structured, too safe. Critics started to turn. The same qualities that once defined his success were now used against him. He was labeled overexposed. His sound was called too soft, too commercial, too calculated. These weren't sudden attacks. They built gradually, growing louder as his presence remained constant. For the first time, Collins wasn't just being heard. He was being questioned. And that shift mattered more than any chart position. Because once a narrative around an artist changes, success alone can't control it anymore. From the outside, everything still looked intact. The sales were still high. The tours were still large. The name still carried weight. But underneath, something had started to move in a different direction. The same visibility that had built his dominance was beginning to erode it. And Collins, who had spent his entire career controlling every detail, was about to face something he couldn't manage the same way. The spotlight was still on him, but it was no longer entirely on his side. By the early 1990s, the shift around Phil Collins was no longer subtle. On paper, he was still one of the most successful artists in the world. His records sold. His tours filled arenas. His name still carried weight. But something deeper had changed, and it wasn't the numbers. It was in perception. The same visibility that once made him dominant now made him a target. People didn't just listen anymore. They judged, they questioned, and slowly they began to turn. The turning point came in 1992. Phil Collins ended his marriage to Jill Tavelman, and the detail that followed him everywhere was simple and brutal. He did it by fax. A short, impersonal message sent across a machine. Whether the full story was more complex didn't matter. The media didn't need nuance. The image was too strong. The man who built his career on emotional honesty was suddenly reduced to a symbol of detachment. The contrast made it worse. The nice guy who sang about heartbreak was now seen as cold. The backlash didn't explode. It spread. Headlines reframed him. Public perception shifted. And once that shift happened, everything else began to be interpreted through it. His music didn't change overnight, but how people heard it did. What once felt sincere now felt calculated to some listeners. What once felt controlled now felt artificial. At the same time, the culture around him was changing. The early 1990s brought a different sound into the center. Grunge and alternative rock replaced polished pop. Artists who embraced imperfection, anger, and rawness began to dominate. Compared to that movement, Collins' music fell out of place. Not because it lacked quality, but because it represented a different era. He didn't disappear immediately. His records still sold. His shows still drew crowds. But the respect he once held began to erode. He became a symbol of something the new generation was moving away from. The more he remained visible, the more that perception hardened. Behind that public shift, his private life was becoming more unstable. Years of constant touring had already created distance in his relationships. Emotional disconnection had been building long before it became visible. The end of his marriage wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the moment it surfaced. What had been quiet became public. And once it was public, it became part of his identity in the eyes of others. Collins didn't respond with confrontation. He withdrew. The more the outside world grew louder, the more he moved inward. Interviews became less frequent. Public appearances became more controlled. But internally, the pressure didn't decrease. It accumulated. Years of unresolved strain began to surface in ways that were harder to manage. Alcohol became part of that pattern. Not as excess, not as image, as escape. He drank to sleep. He drank to silence the thoughts that didn't stop when everything else did. Over time, that habit shifted into dependency. The line between control and avoidance disappeared. And for someone who had built his entire life on precision, that loss of control was destabilizing. The contradiction deepened. Publicly, he was still seen as composed and reliable. Privately, the structure was breaking. Then his body began to fail him. Decades of drumming at a high level had already placed long-term stress on his back and joints. By the 2000s, That stress turned into serious physical damage. A spinal injury led to nerve problems that affected his hands. The same hands that had defined his career began to lose sensation. He struggled to hold drumsticks. The accuracy that once defined him became difficult to maintain. For a drummer, this wasn't just a limitation. It was something more fundamental. It was a loss of identity. Before the fame, before the voice, before the image, he was a drummer. That was the foundation. Everything else was built on top of it. And now, that foundation was unstable. The one place where he had always had control was gone. No amount of discipline or repetition could restore it to what it had been. At the same time, his hearing began to decline. Partial hearing loss made performing even more difficult. The connection between what he played and what he heard, something essential to any musician, became unreliable. The body that had supported decades of precision was no longer responding the same way. This wasn't a single collapse. It was layered. Public perception had shifted. Personal relationships had fractured. Physical ability was declining. Each layer reinforced the others. There was no separation between career, identity, and body anymore. When one weakened, everything else followed. By the late 2000s, Collins had largely stepped away from music, not through a dramatic announcement, but through absence. Fewer appearances, fewer releases, longer periods of silence. From the outside, it looked like a quiet retirement. From the inside, it was something else. He had reached a point where continuing in the same way was no longer possible. The discipline that built a career could not fix nerve damage. Control could not reverse physical decline. And the external validation that once defined success no longer held the same meaning. When the internal structure was breaking, for the first time in his life, Phil Collins was facing something he couldn't manage the way he always had. And the collapse didn't come as a single moment. It came slowly, over years, until the version of himself that the world knew no longer existed in the same way. By the end of the 2000s, Phil Collins had reached a point where stepping away no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the only option. The identity he had built over decades, drummer, performer, hitmaker, was no longer fully accessible to him. Physically, he couldn't do what he once did. Mentally, the weight of everything that had accumulated made it difficult to move forward with any clarity. From the outside, it looked like retirement. From the inside, it felt closer to disappearance. Around 2010, that sense of withdrawal deepened. He was largely absent from the public eye. No major releases, no tours, no clear direction. The industry moved on, and for the first time, Collins was no longer part of the conversation. The silence around him wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost unnoticed, and that made it heavier. What began to shift that trajectory didn't come from the industry or the audience. It came from something more personal. His children. As they grew older, they started to understand the scale of what their father had done, not as headlines or chart numbers, but as something real and lasting. They didn't see him as a figure who had faded. They saw someone who still had a place, even if it looked different. And more importantly, they wanted him to return, not as a version he used to be, but as a version he could still be. That changed the motivation. For the first time in years, the idea of coming back wasn't tied to pressure or expectation. It wasn't about reclaiming dominance or correcting public perception. It was about not disappearing completely, about staying present in some form, even if that form was limited. Collins began to rebuild slowly. He addressed his alcohol dependency and worked towards stabilizing his health. Recovery wasn't immediate. It was gradual, inconsistent at times, and required him to confront the reality that some things would not return. The biggest shift wasn't physical. It was acceptance. He could not go back to being the drummer he once was, but he could still be a singer. That realization created a different kind of path forward, not a return to the past, but an adjustment to the present. Instead of trying to rebuild the same identity, he began shaping a new version of it, one that worked within his limitations rather than against them. In 2015, he announced a return. By 2017, he launched the Not Dead Yet tour. The title carried a quiet honesty. It acknowledged everything that had happened without trying to erase it. This wasn't a comeback built on spectacle. It was built on persistence. The stage looked different now. Collins didn't stand. He sat. He didn't play drums. He focused on his voice. The energy was reduced, but the intention was clearer. Every performance carried a different weight, not because it was technically perfect, but because it existed at all. The audience responded differently as well. They weren't there to see the version of him from the 1980s. They were there to witness someone continuing despite visible change. The connection shifted from admiration of dominance to recognition of endurance, and that shift mattered. For the first time in his career, Collins wasn't trying to control everything. He was working within what remained. He wasn't defining himself by what he had lost, but by what he could still do. It wasn't a return to the top. It was something quieter, a different kind of rebirth, one built not on success, but on acceptance. By the late 2010s, Phil Collins was no longer part of the current music race. He wasn't chasing charts, trends, or relevance in the way he once had. The industry had moved on, shaped by new sounds and new faces. But Collins didn't disappear. He shifted into something else, something more permanent. His music never left. In the Air Tonight continued to live far beyond its original release. The drum fill alone became one of the most recognized moments in modern music, reused in films, commercials, and live performances across generations. It wasn't just remembered. It was studied, replayed, and reinterpreted. Few songs reached that level of cultural permanence, and fewer still remain relevant decades after their release. His catalog held a similar weight. Songs like Against All Odds and Another Day in Paradise continue to circulate, not as nostalgia alone, but as part of the emotional language of popular music. They were simple, direct, and widely understood. That accessibility, once criticized as too safe, became part of what allowed them to last. In 1999, Collins won an Academy Award for You'll Be in My Heart from Disney's Tarzan. It was a different kind of recognition, separate from the peak years of the 1980s. But it reinforced something important. His ability to write music that connected emotionally hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted form. One of the most defining images of his later life came during Genesis' final reunion tour in the early 2020s. Collins was on stage, but not behind the drums. He sat singing while his son, Nick Collins, took his place at the drum kit. It was a quiet but powerful transition. The role that had defined him for decades was now carried forward by the next generation directly, without reinterpretation. That moment said more than any award or statistic. It showed that his legacy wasn't just in recordings or chart positions. It was in continuation, in influence that could be passed on, not just remembered. Collins no longer needed to prove anything. The numbers were already there. The records sold, the awards won, the milestones reached. But those metrics were no longer the point. What remained was something less measurable but more durable. He had become part of the structure of modern music itself, not as a current force, but as a reference point, a standard, a piece of history that newer artists, knowingly or not, continue to build on. And unlike the peak of his career, this version of his presence didn't depend on constant visibility. It remained, even in stillness. Phil Collins once had complete control over everything that defined him. The sound, the timing, the performance, the image. For years, nothing seemed out of place. Every step followed a structure he understood. Every success reinforced the idea that control was enough. And then, slowly, that structure began to break. Not in one moment, not with a single collapse, but across years. A public image that turned, relationships that failed, a body that stopped responding the way it always had. Each piece didn't end his story on its own, but together, they changed it completely. What makes his story different is not the fall. It's what came after. He didn't return to the same version of himself. He didn't rebuild the identity that made him famous. That version was gone. Instead, he continued in a form that no longer depended on perfection, no longer depended on control. He showed up anyway, not as the dominant figure of the 1980s, not as the drummer who could command every beat, but as someone who accepted what remained and chose to stay present within it. And that leaves a quieter question behind. If everything that defines you can be taken away, your skills, your image, your place in the world, what is left? Phil Collins never answered that directly. He didn't need to, because the answer is in the fact that he kept going.